Let's talk politics.
No! God, please, no!
No, seriously, let's talk politics. You may have noticed, unless you've been living in a cave for the past month, that a certain presidential election just took place in the United States of America. Now, what got complicated very quickly was that the incumbent President Donald Trump has currently refused to concede the election, but at the same time, simultaneously, his rival Joe Biden has already started talking to foreign leaders, and it would seem is starting to assemble his backroom staff. Now, if that's not complicated enough, we face a situation where there are official legal challenges by Trump and his Republican team that asserts that in states such as Michigan and Pennsylvania, there is clear evidence of voter fraud and improper vote counting. Now, if that's found, you can imagine an already complicated situation is about to get a heck of a lot worse. Cue the American dream. It's the conclusion to an election campaign that has already been totally marred and ruined by unprecedented bitterness, division, and rancor. I mean, just look at this footage of the two candidates in one of the presidential debates.
Please, sir, stop.
I would never say that.
Stop.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen.
It's such a mess. I've got an idea. How about we all just get along?
I love you, you love me.
No, not quite like that. And that's Barney. You know, sometimes it's easy to look at democracy in the United States and indeed across the globe and simply throw your hands up in absolute despair. And you take a step back and think, how on earth did we arrive at a place and time where my political opponents, they're no longer just wrong or mistaken, they are pure evil. And this unfortunate combination of a global pandemic and an unprecedentedly bitter presidential campaign has caused this eruption of violence, hatred, and bile on both sides of the divide. Oh, and you think this is just an American problem? Oh, no. This is a global problem. Just think a few years back to the bitterness and division we saw over the Brexit referendum, and more recently with the unexpected Tory landslide in the general election here in the United Kingdom. I mean, just check out this footage of a trainee doctor and what she had to say about Boris Johnson's election.
I wish him a horrible death. I don't know if you're allowed to put that online.
I mean, you're aspiring to be a doctor, did you say?
I plan to work in the NHS. I plan to be a doctor. I plan to actually care about people.
I get it, okay? Calm down, I understand. People don't like Trump. Other people don't like Biden. Further people don't like Johnson. Some other people don't like Corbyn. I get it. Why is it that we've allowed ourselves to arrive at a situation where those differences of opinion have started being coined in terms that you can't even imagine being taken seriously, but everyone's saying them? Like, why is it that anyone who is to the left of my political opinion is the same as Stalin?
Most of them want to give everything away.
Stop trying to give everything away.
The Democrat Party is a crime syndicate.
And everyone to the right of my political opinion is the same as Hitler.
Actually, he's not like Hitler. He has a Twitter feed, he has that ugly orange thing on top of his head, and he has nuclear weapons. He is more dangerous than Hitler ever could have been.
Seriously, how on earth did that become a thing? And it's not just a thing now, it's acceptable, it's normal. And if I could push the boat a little further out, it's not just a thing, or acceptable, or normal. To a degree, it's actually expected that a person will speak about their political opinions using language which is totally extreme. We seem to be pushing this agenda of character martyrdom, whereby a person literally, their character lives or dies, rises or falls, simply on the basis of individual political opinion and belief. If I'm holding on to my political ideology, and I'll defend it to the death, and anyone who dares oppose me, I will crush them. How can it possibly be healthy that a person has one belief that's different to our own, and we reject them entirely? Now, some might argue that actually the violence and the demonstrations and the rallies and the civil unrest and the riots and the cars driving through crowds of people and people getting shot and stabbed and murdered, oh, that's just democracy, this is just democracy in action, what do you expect? Democracy as a word means mob rule. It means giving power to the people.
Power to the people!
Maybe it's a good thing or a healthy thing in a painful way. We seem to have arrived at an era where instead of political parties being so close together there's almost nothing to argue about apart from a couple of tax points and maybe the level of insurance provided by a healthcare. Maybe the fact we're seeing more radicalism and more passion and more division is actually symptomatic of an idea that democracy really is flourishing. The fact that there are so many things to bicker and argue about, surely some might argue that can only be a good thing and can only lead to a stronger and healthier democracy in the long run. Maybe democracy, in its absolute essence, is nothing more than controlled anarchy. And maybe it's naive and totally impractical for us to expect it to be anything more or anything better. But on the other hand, I think we can all agree there's something deeply unsettling and in fact upsetting when we watch these scenes unfolding, not just in the United States, but across the democratic world. There's something bothersome about the hatred and the violence and the division that all of us wish we could find a solution to. So, which one is it? Are we watching the end and the unravelling of democracy as we know it? Or, in an era driven by technology and social media, perhaps democracy is evolving into something far more vibrant than it's ever been in human history? We caught up with Dr. Alan Mendoza, the founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, to explore that question in much greater detail. So Alan, if I could start by asking you your take on, do you feel that there does seem to be a growing consensus now that politics has almost evolved into a zero-sum game whereby my political opponent is no longer just wrong or mistaken, but I start to coin them and frame them as almost pure evil with a violence and a bitterness and a hatred that perhaps a few decades ago we just didn't see? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis to make right now. I mean, if you look at politics, it has become couched in very personal terms. In the old days, not that long ago, in the old days, you'd disagree with someone on policy, you'd say, I don't agree with you, you're wrong, but you'd end up still having some respect as, for individuals on the other side. Now, increasingly, and it's obviously mainly seen at the fringes of politics. I mean, the further right and left you get, there are still many centrists. But on that level, you do see, we are absolutely right, you are absolutely wrong. And not only are you wrong, but for you to hold that view tells us there's something deficient with you as a person. And clearly that's a big shift. And it obviously causes problems because it means it's very difficult to unite as a society or to respect each other's differences and still engage in civil discourse.
What do you see as the role, perhaps, of social media in driving this shift towards a cancel culture whereby a person who espouses or holds or expresses an opinion that may actually be vile and totally wrong, but that ends up consuming that person's character and their future in its entirety permanently? Do you see a role of social media in that?
Oh, social media has absolutely driven this trend. I mean, the reality is, if you look at social media today, we have a very combative arena where you have to, particularly Twitter is the worst for this if you think about it, because it's very, very short form. You've got a very small number of characters to make your point. If you don't make your point front and center, nobody will read your tweet, basically. So therefore, it puts a premium, if you like, on being aggressive and on being abrasive in your own messaging. And that leads, obviously, to combat. If you're going to start in that way, it's a bit different from other forms of media where you can obviously spend more time crafting a message. But if you start from that point of view where you have to score a hit immediately, it immediately leads to tensions between people because you're going to end up having a response from the person as well. Or you're going to have others pile in to share it, retweet it, move it forward. So as a result, you end up very quickly snowballing. You have a movement which starts with one. If one person picks it up with a big following, it moves on. And also, by the way, gives power to people who in the past would never have had power. And this is an extraordinary change in our society. For many years, experts were the people we listened to, people who had shown us by virtue of their education, by virtue of life experience or their work experience, that they had some degree of expertise to talk about things. What social media has done, and obviously it's welcome in one sense, it's cast open the elite, if you like, allowed people to comment. But what it's also done is completely move expertise to one side. Nobody needs to be an expert to develop a mass following on Twitter. You just need to persuade other people to follow you. The difference now is that we do get a sense that within our societies there are maybe increasing numbers of people who share that view, whether it is out of guilt, it might be true, or they just want a quiet life. They're willing to go along with the narrative in a way they might not have done in previous times. And I suppose that the danger now is, if you like, the virtue signaling, the naming and shaming, that kind of aspect, is forcing people to go along with agendas they may not actually deep down want to support, but they're scared of standing up for it. And I think there's a lot of what the social media age has created, a lot of fear of being bullied and of being targeted online.
So is it, to jump in there, is it symptomatic of our people? I think it's fair to say we are seeing more and more frequent violent uprisings. It could be it's sensationalized, or it could be we're just more aware of it because of social media and because of mass media. Is that symptomatic of people giving up, as it were, and despairing of the political system? And secondly,
if I could interrupt there just quickly,
sure.
where are you seeing that violence?
I think with the uprisings, the riots, the looting, some of which was certainly justified, some of which was certainly not. In America.
There's riots in America all the time. I mean, seriously, if you look back, do you remember the O.J. Simpson case, the Rodney King beating, 90s? There are riots frequently in the US, and cross-country riots, things that people don't see about. What's different, I think you're right to point out, what is different is that we get information real time these days. We didn't get it in real time in the past. And as a result, we always go, oh, we've never seen anything like this before. No, we have seen plenty like this before. The difference is we're living through it in a different way. So there's a question about in the old days, how you'd reach people was by a landline. Most people watching this won't have a clue what a landline is. They've got no idea at all. They won't understand there was a time before mobile phones when all of us...
The days of dial-up internet where you could sort of
internet,
brew a tea, make a meal.
You had to share a phone with your family.
Or a fax. Okay. God forbid a fax.
Precisely. So look, it's quite extraordinary how things have changed in that regard. And look, we're dealing with a fast-moving and fast-paced changing society, and I think we're struggling to cope with those changes and work out how that gets reflected in our conversations and in how we act.
So is it, I mean, we speak about echo chambers, and we've spoken about the role of social media. Has social media become an echo chamber for dramatization of really, seems to be you're saying, events that we've lived through before and we survived them, and in many cases we flourished as a result of them and grew from them? Is that therefore, is it fair to say that despair is actually being driven in an ironic way by our free press, by our open media, by our freedom of speech and freedom of expression?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly good sort of theory to come up with. I think you've got the sense that because we know about more things, we then get more depressed about them. But they were always happening. They were happening. If you contrast, say, today with the 1930s, nobody can possibly believe that we're living in the same time as 1930s. We're not. And
yet people do frequently make that comparison.
It's not the same thing at all. It's nonsense to make that comparison. And they're just not reflective, obviously, of what was happening in the 1930s, because very few people were alive who are still alive now who can actually tell you in person what was happening. And so you're going on vague histories and trying to draw analogies that way without actually analysing from a historical perspective what happened in the 1930s compared to today. The one interesting part of living in this time is that everyone is engaged in politics. I mean, there's so much interest in what's happening in our countries, in our societies, and that can only be a good thing. It's great that people want to get engaged. I think, really the plea is get engaged in a sensible way. Get engaged in a way, by all means, believe in things. It's good to believe in things. That's a good starting point. But never forget that there is wisdom collectively as well as individually, and that we can always learn from other people in that process.
Thank you, Alan. Dr. Mendoza, thank you so much again for joining us and for making the time for this fascinating conversation. It sounds easy, doesn't it, right? I mean, it should be relatively easy if only we changed our behavior in a way that we made a purposeful, conscious effort to go out there and engage with people whose opinions we don't share. Should be relatively straightforward, right? The thing is, though, and forgive me for saying it like this, Judaism and Jews have a well-earned and well-deserved reputation of, being quite an argumentative people and actually thriving in argument. So I wonder, what does the Torah actually have to say about engaging someone who you think is totally and fundamentally wrong? Now, the Talmud recounts one such major argument and dispute, right? Follow this carefully. It tells a story in the late Second Temple era. Was the Second Temple Rabban Gamliel? No, there was. No, there was. There must have been, or there wouldn't have been a Sanhedrin. Was there? Yeah.
Definitely keeping that in.
Well, me talking to myself. Now, the Talmud recounts one such major dispute that threatened to split the entire Jewish people. It went a little something like this. Way back, many centuries ago, not long after the Bible began,
I closed my eyes,
there was a dispute in the Sanhedrin, the High Court, between the Nasi, the president of the court, who was called Rabbi Gamliel, and the Av Bet Din, the spiritual leader, the elder sage of the court, who was someone called Rabbi Yehoshua. And cutting a long story short, the two men had a difference of opinion in how to calculate the Jewish calendar. You know, that magnificent thing that's basically subdivided between days we can't eat and days we're meant to eat way too much. Now, in Rabbi Gamliel's opinion, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the whole year, fell on a certain day of the week. But Rabbi Yehoshua stood up and said, by my calculations, you've got that wrong, and the holiest day of the entire Jewish calendar falls on another day entirely. Now you can imagine, the High Court, the Sanhedrin, they're sitting there with bated breath waiting. I mean, if Twitter had existed in those days, it would have exploded. When is the holiest day of the year? Do we follow Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion or Rabbi Gamliel's? Which one is right? Until Rabbi Gamliel pulled rank and stood up and said, as it is, that I am the Nasi, the president, I am the prince, as it were, of royal lineage of this court, I demand that you, Rabbi Yehoshua, you swallow your pride, you pick up your staff and your money, and you join me for a meal on the day that you think is Yom Kippur. The entire people waited. I mean, you can imagine, this would have broken the internet, just like we're waiting now for December the 8th, for all the recounts and all the legal battles to be done, and on December the 14th for the Electoral College to make up its mind and declare one or the other as the President of the United States of America. The Jewish people waited in anticipation. And Rabbi Gamliel sat at home on a day that, according to his calculation, was a weekday, and suddenly there was a knock on the door. And he opens the door, and standing at the threshold is his detractor, his opponent, Rabbi Yehoshua. And you know something amazing? He's carrying his staff, he's carrying his wallet, his purse, and he says, I'm here to join you for a meal on the day that I calculated was Yom Kippur, but I'm deferring to your opinion. Now, whatever you think about that story and whichever of the two characters you see yourself more as, it's so important to understand that this isn't about rank or authority or seniority. This is about the ability of one person to look beyond their opinion and with a real profound and I think beautiful humility to think to themselves, what will happen to society, to the Jewish community, if I stubbornly follow my opinion to the bitter end? In other words, even though in Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion he had desecrated and broken the most sanctified and holy day of the whole Jewish calendar, he realized, he took that step back and he said to himself, if I stubbornly pursue my opinion and I don't have that humility and that deference of respecting the opinion of others, what will happen is the calendar will split. And my supporters will fast and keep Yom Kippur on one day, and my colleague Rabbi Gamliel's supporters will fast and keep Yom Kippur on a totally different day until Judaism itself starts to unravel. And sometimes we see that nowadays in politics as well. Sometimes maybe we should be asking ourselves exactly the same question. It's fine, it's even a good thing to have an opinion. But to what extent are we willing to push the boundaries of how long we cling to that opinion for? Until we reach a stage that maybe we're not too far away from now in global politics, where it's simply a mess of too many people clinging on to too few opinions for too long a time, to the point where perhaps democracy itself has started to split and started to unravel. You know what? I've got a headache. We're not going to solve all of this today, right now, but who knows? Maybe another time we'll touch base and figure out the world's problems. Is that you mentioned, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is that some skeptics would look at that and think, well, that's not quite, it's a bit of like a, escape route out of what we really should have a situation where my friend is my friend, straight out. Right. Is it a, let's say, a stable platform from which we can build onwards?
It can be if these countries are serious about it, and they are.